It is said that people over 100 years old will become evil ghosts that eat people. On my great-grandmother's 100th birthday, my yard was crowded with people. Grandpa boiled 10 eggs. He put the eggs in front of my great-grandmother and whispered, "Mom, if you can peel one of these 10 eggs, you can stay at home." I heard from the villagers that evil ghosts cannot see eggs, only people can see them. My great-grandmother frowned and said aggrievedly, "Queasy, my mother's hands are shaking and it is difficult for her to hold chopsticks normally. Why do you still let me peel eggs?" My great-grandmother is not in good health. When she was young, her hands were injured and she often trembled. Grandpa continued, "Mom, everyone in the village is watching. If you can't peel the eggs, you can't stay at home." Grandmother said pitifully, "Your father died early, and I raised 4 of you brothers by myself. How can I peel eggs with my shaking hands?" When my great-grandmother said this, her hands had already started to tremble. Grandpa frowned and didn't speak for a long time. Seeing that my grandfather didn't speak, my grandmother continued to speak. "Mom, let me say something unpleasant. Before the new year, Mrs. Zhao also refused to peel eggs. Her son insisted on keeping Mrs. Zhao at home, and as a result, 7 people died in the family, and the family was almost extinct." As soon as my grandmother finished speaking, my great-grandmother's face changed. She looked at my grandmother with a fierce look, as if she was about to get angry. Seeing that my great-grandmother didn't speak, my grandmother said again, "Mom, you refuse to peel eggs. Haven't you become an evil ghost?" As soon as my grandmother finished speaking, the people watching the excitement in the village were all stunned and stared at my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother narrowed her eyes and muttered in a low voice, I peel eggs." My great-grandmother's hands were still shaking, and they were shaking very badly. She couldn't hold the egg steadily after trying several times. In the end, it was my grandfather who stuffed the egg into my great-grandmother's hand. My great-grandmother held the egg and turned her eyes back and forth twice, and suddenly the lights in the house went out. Everyone was stunned. When the lights were turned on, Grandma had already peeled the eggs. Grandpa was relieved after seeing Grandma peel the eggs. Grandpa said to the villagers, "Let's go." The villagers left one after another, and only the family members were left in the yard. Grandpa smiled and said that Mom had peeled the eggs, and we had to celebrate Mom's 100th birthday. My third grandfather also smiled and said, "Mom, you are so lucky, I will celebrate your 100th birthday." My grandma grinned and stared at the people in the room. She glanced around and then smiled and said, "I am lucky, I am lucky, I am more lucky than your father." Grandpa said, "Let's kill pigs and sheep now, and have a big celebration for 3 days. You little kids will stay in the house with Grandma." After saying this, Grandpa went to the yard to catch pigs. Only a few of us children and Grandma were left in the house. My grandma stared at us with a smile. She waved to the youngest Yuanbao, and Yuanbao ran to Grandma. Grandma held Yuanbao in her arms and sniffed him. My grandma asked, "How old is Yuanbao?" Yuanbao replied softly, 4 years old. My grandma also reached out and touched Yuanbao's face. She smiled and said, "Yuanbao smells so good." When my grandma said this, I saw her teeth became sharper and seemed to be longer. My grandma seemed to notice that I was looking at her. She turned her head to look at me and waved at me, "Yuanfu, come here too." My grandma was very thin and her face was very bad. I always felt that she was glowing yellow and lifeless. I don't know why, but I was a little scared. My grandma saw that I was standing still, and she was visibly unhappy. "Yuanfu, come here." I walked to my grandma with my hands and feet pinched. My grandma pulled me into her arms with all her strength. She also pinched the flesh on my back and said, "Yuanfu is fatter than Yuanbao." My grandma laughed after saying this. My grandma let go of me and Yuanbao and waved to Xiying and Ziwei again. The 2 of them were older, but only 7 or 8 years old. My grandmother said, "Xiying, Ziwei, come here for a hug." Xiying came to my grandmother, and my grandmother touched Xiying's face and said dissatisfiedly, "Too thin, all bones." My grandmother looked at Ziwei again and said, "Ziwei, come here." Ziwei stood there without moving, and said, "I won't go, you're a man-eating evil ghost." As soon as Ziwei finished speaking, my grandmother's face changed, and she said with a gloomy face, "Stinky girl, what did you say? Do you believe me or not, I will hit you in the face?" Ziwei said, "I saw it all just now, the egg was not peeled by you, but by my great-grandfather. He stuffed the peeled egg into your hand. My grandmother said with a hard face, "Nonsense, I will beat you to death." Ziyue said seriously, "I am not talking nonsense." My grandmother's eyes turned back and forth twice, and she took out 2 candy balls from her pocket, and we children all stared at her. The sugar balls are very sweet and can only be eaten during the Chinese New Year. My grandmother narrowed her eyes and said, "Ziyue, come here, I'll give you a sugar ball." Ziyue was stunned for a few seconds, and she stared at the sugar ball eagerly. My grandmother said softly, "Come here, come to my grandmother." My grandmother smiled and spoke softly. Ziyue came to my grandmother. My grandmother stuffed all the sugar balls into Ziyue's mouth and asked, "Is it sweet?" Ziyue nodded and said, "Sweet." My grandmother smiled, "Ziyue, you saw it wrong just now. The egg was peeled by grandmother. If grandmother is really a man-eating evil ghost, how can she give you sugar balls to eat?" Ziyue hesitated for a few seconds and didn't say anything. Among the children, only Ziyue got the sugar ball, and we could only watch eagerly. Grandma said, "Don't watch, I only have 2 sugar balls, go out and play." My grandmother drove us out, but she pulled Ziyue's hand and asked her to stay. We went to the yard to play, and Xiuying was unhappy. She said, "Grandma must have secretly given Ziyue something delicious if she kept Ziyue." I nodded to agree. There are many children in the family, but they eat little. Some can eat, while others can't. We have long been used to it. When it was night, 3 tables were set up in my yard. Everyone in the family sat at the table to eat, except Aunt San. She shouted for Ziyue, but no one responded. Aunt San was Ziyue's mother. She asked us children if we had seen Ziyue. Xiuying said Ziyue was in the west room just now. As soon as Xiuying finished speaking, Aunt San looked at my grandmother and asked, "Grandma, where's Ziyue?" Grandma said, "I don't know, go to the toilet and see." She said she went to the toilet just now. Aunt San hurried to the toilet, looked inside carefully and said, "No." My grandmother frowned and said, "Then I don't know." Aunt San was stunned for a few seconds and almost fell to the ground. She shouted for Ziyue, but no one responded. Grandpa asked us all to help look for her. We searched inside and outside my yard, but we couldn't see Ziyue. Aunt San was so anxious that she stamped her feet, tears welled up in her eyes. "Where was Ziyue?" Grandpa said to Grandma, "Mom, you take the kids to eat first, we will go find Ziyue first." After saying this, Grandpa walked out of the yard, calling Ziyue as he walked. People in the yard also went to find Ziyue, leaving only a few of us at home. There was pork and fish on the table, very rich, and we children sat on the stools and ate with big mouthfuls. My grandma seemed to have no appetite, she sat on the stool and didn't eat the vegetables. I asked, "Grandma, why don't you eat?" My grandma laughed and said, "I'm not hungry yet, you guys eat more." After saying this, Grandma went into the warehouse. There was a bloody smell in the warehouse, and a basin of pig blood was in the warehouse. My grandma went into the warehouse for a long time before coming out. When she came out, I saw blood on the corner of her clothes, but the blood was not very obvious. My grandma smiled and said, "Go to bed early after eating." After saying this, Grandma went into the house. We kids wolfed down our food and were soon full. We kids went into the house, and Grandma had already spread out the bedding. Seeing us go in, Grandma smiled and said, "Let's go to bed on the king." We kids went to the king, and then Grandma turned off the light, and I closed my eyes and went to sleep. Late at night, I heard a crunch sound. Someone was eating, but who would eat so late? I opened my eyes and saw Yuan Bao and Xiuying were both sleeping. Only my grandma was lying on her side with her back to me, and the sound came from her. "Grandma, what are you eating?" My grandma's back was obviously stiff, and she said with her back to me, "I'm hungry, eating carrots." "Grandma, you have bad teeth, why are you eating carrots?" As soon as I finished speaking, Grandma turned her head to look at me. She looked at me with a strange and sinister look, as if she would strangle me to death if I asked one more question. Grandma told me to go to bed quickly, so I had to close my eyes and continue to sleep. But I could still hear the crunch sound. The sound lasted for a long time and disappeared when it was almost dawn. The next morning, everyone in the family came back. They had been looking for Ziyue all night but couldn't find her. Third aunt collapsed on the ground and cried loudly. Everyone in the family advised third aunt to relax. Third aunt cried and said, Ziyue never ran around and was very obedient. Why did she disappear after coming out of the west room? When third aunt said this, her eyes were fixed on my grandmother. Grandma frowned and asked, Shanzi's wife, what do you mean by this? Third aunt cried and said, I just asked Xu, and Xu said that you and Ziyue were quarreling in the room. Ziyue said that you are a man-eating evil ghost, and that the eggs were packed for you by your uncle, and then you gave Ziyue candy and left Ziyue alone in the room. Ziyue was killed by you. The uncle in third aunt's mouth was my grandfather. My grandfather was stunned for a few seconds and said, Shanzi's wife, don't talk nonsense. I didn't peel the eggs. Aunt San sneered and said, when Grandma was about to peel the eggs, the light went out, and when the light came on, Grandma had already peeled the eggs. This is strange. I just want to know where my Ziyue is. My grandmother narrowed her eyes and said, you can't believe what children say. Children will lie. I peeled the egg. As soon as my grandmother finished speaking, my third aunt took an egg from the warehouse and said, you peel this egg. As long as you peel the egg, I will believe that you are not an evil ghost. As soon as my third aunt finished speaking, my third uncle rushed up. He kicked my third aunt down with one foot, and cursed loudly, what kind of person are you? How dare you be the overlord when Shanzi is not at home? Go home. My third uncle is my third aunt's father-in-law. My third uncle has been working in the city for a long time and has not come back. Moreover, my third uncle and my grandfather look very similar, and you can't tell them apart if you don't look carefully. My third aunt cried and said, Ziyue is gone, and I don't want to live anymore. If you don't peel the egg in front of me today, I will recognize that you are an evil ghost and give me Ziyue's life. My third aunt cried and made a fuss, and my third uncle wanted to hit my third aunt, but was stopped by my grandfather. Grandpa said, Ziyue is missing, and it is natural for a mother to be anxious. After saying this, Grandpa looked at my grandmother. Mother, Shanzi's wife doesn't believe you. Just peel the egg again and don't let her make a fuss. My grandmother glanced at my third uncle, and my third uncle's eyes turned back and forth twice. He said unhappily, Ziyue is my granddaughter, and I am more anxious than anyone else when she is missing. But you can't blame your mother for being anxious. This is not a matter of wrapping an egg. You all don't believe in your mother and treat her as an evil ghost. As soon as my third uncle finished speaking, my grandmother's eyes turned red. She cried and said, I want to be an evil ghost. If I become an evil ghost, you can beat me to death and I won't be an eyesore anymore. I am just a burden. My grandmother cried in the yard, crying sadly, and everyone in the yard looked at each other. A young wife advised my third aunt, Shanzi's wife, you must have thought too much. Let's go to the village to look for her again? Maybe Ziyue is still in the village. My third aunt cried and said, Ziyue is very obedient and it is impossible for her to run around. She must have killed her. My third aunt pointed at my great-grandmother with resentment in her eyes. If you don't peel this egg today, this matter will not end. My third uncle shouted at my third aunt, what do you want to do? If you dare to make trouble again, get out of my house. I don't want you as my daughter-in-law. Grandpa persuaded, Lao San, what are you doing? What you said is too ugly. Why am I saying something ugly? A granddaughter-in-law dared to rebel against the sky and bully my mother. She really spoiled her. My third aunt's eyes were red. She pointed at my third uncle and cursed, Ziyue is your granddaughter. You don't care at all. Are you still a human being? As soon as my third aunt finished speaking, my third uncle wanted to beat my third aunt again. My great-grandmother frowned and said, okay, stop arguing, bring me the eggs. My third uncle widened his eyes. Mother, are you crazy? My third aunt hurriedly handed the egg to my great-grandmother. People in the yard gathered around and stared at my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother easily peeled the egg and put the peeled egg in my third aunt's hand. Shanzi's wife, do you believe it this time? My third aunt was stunned for a few seconds, and tears still couldn't stop falling. Grandma said, I am old and don't want to celebrate my 100th birthday. You all go, let a few children accompany me, I think it's too noisy when there are too many people. When my great-grandmother said this, she kept staring at us children with the corner of her eyes. My great-grandmother's eyes made me feel creepy. My third uncle said, since you are upset, let's go back to our own homes, don't disturb you, and let a few children accompany you well. Grandma nodded and said, let's go. My third aunt was still crying, where did Ziyue go? Everyone in the courtyard comforted my third aunt, asking her to go home first. Maybe Ziwei had already gone home. My third aunt walked out of the courtyard with red eyes. Everyone in the courtyard left, leaving only the few people in our family, Yuanbao and Xuying. My grandmother smiled and said, "You three will sleep with me in the west room tonight." Grandma frowned and said, "Mom, Yuanfu should live in the east room. The Kang in the west room is too small. Anyway, you will live in my house for retirement and you can see Yuanfu every day, so let Yuanbao and Xuying stay with you for a few days." The smile on my great-grandmother's face froze. She hesitated for a few seconds before nodding. After saying this, my great-grandmother led Yuanbao and Xuying into the west room. My grandmother led me into the east room. Grandpa was sitting on the earthen king in the east room smoking a cigarette. I didn't know what he was thinking about, and his eyes were empty. Grandma asked, "Old man, what are you thinking about?" Grandpa sighed and said, "How could Ziwei be lost? Where did this child go?" Grandma said, "Most likely she was eaten by hungry ghosts." As soon as my grandmother finished speaking, my grandfather changed his face and said, "What are you talking about? Mother peeled the eggs in front of you. Why do you still doubt Mother?" Grandma frowned and said, "Ziwei is obedient and a sensible child. It's impossible for her to run around. If you ask me, she is in Mother's room. If you don't believe it, let's go to the window tonight to see if Mother is an evil ghost." Grandpa sighed and said helplessly, "You are always so suspicious. Even if Mother is not an evil ghost, you will say she is an evil ghost." My grandma curled her lips and said, "There is a strong smell of blood on Mother. I went to the warehouse just now and took a look. The pot of pig blood was gone." I also asked Xuying, and Xuying said that only Mother had entered the warehouse. This pot of pig blood was probably drunk by Mother. Grandpa glared at my grandma and said, "Nonsense. I'll go to the warehouse to see." Grandpa was about to get off the earthen king when my grandma stopped him. "I also suspect this, but don't alarm the snake. Let's go to the window late at night. If Mother is an evil ghost, she will definitely attack Yuanbao and Xuying. Let's go and see at night." As soon as my grandma finished speaking, I saw a shadow passing under the window. I looked carefully again, but I didn't find anything. Did I see it wrong just now? Just when I was confused, my grandma said, "Evil ghosts eat people and drink blood. The fate of old Zhao is likely to be the fate of my mother. I think we should invite a Taoist priest in advance." Grandpa frowned and said, "Yuanbao and Xuying are both my mother's flesh and blood, and nothing can happen to them." My grandma curled her lips and was too lazy to quarrel with my grandpa. When my grandpa opened the door carefully late at night, he and my grandma went to lean on the window. I wanted to go, but my grandpa wouldn't let me. I had to lean on the window and look out, and soon my grandpa and grandma came back. My grandpa was very happy and said with a smile on his face, "Did you see it? Mother, Yuanbao and Xuying are all sleeping. How can there be the evil ghost you said?" My grandma frowned and said, "It shouldn't be. Am I thinking too much?" "That's what you think too much," my grandpa replied. The next morning, Yuanbao and Xuying came out of the west room, and they were alive and kicking and nothing happened. Grandpa said to Grandma, "Mother, Ziwei has not been found yet. Yuanfu and his grandmother will go out to look for it. There is rice in the pot. You can eat first." Grandma said, "Okay, go slowly on the way." My grandmother came to me and whispered, "Yuanfu, stay away from your grandma, don't listen to your grandma." I nodded to show that I understood. After my grandmother gave her instructions, I followed my grandfather out. We kids were playing in the yard, and my grandma was sitting under the wall to bask in the sun. Her eyes stared at us from time to time, and Xuying suddenly said, "I don't want to live in Grandma's house anymore." I asked her, "What's wrong?" She said, "There are mice in Grandma's house, and they bit my fingers." Xuying raised her left hand, and her little finger was really bitten. Yuanbao also said, "I don't want to live in Grandma's house anymore." Xuying asked, "Were you bitten by mice too?" Yuanbao shook his head and said, "I heard Grandma talking in her sleep. She said she wanted to eat me. I was a little scared and I wanted to go home." Xuying said, "I want to go home too." As soon as Xuying finished speaking, I saw my grandmother stand up from the stool. She called me, "Yuanfu, boil some hot water. I will kill a chicken for you guys." We were all stunned and widened our eyes. There are only 3 chickens in my yard, all of which are kept for laying eggs. I hurriedly said, Grandma, can the laying chickens be killed? The last time I ate chicken was during the Chinese New Year, and I haven't eaten chicken for a long time. My grandmother said, yes. Let me catch the chicken quickly. I was a little hesitant and stood still. My grandmother said to Xiuying again, Xiuying, go catch the chicken. Xiuying glanced at me and whispered, can you catch it? Seeing that Xiuying didn't move, my grandmother stomped her feet in anger. My grandmother went straight into the chicken coop and caught a hen. My grandmother went into the warehouse again, cut off the hen's head with a knife, turned around and said to me, Yuanfu, boil some hot water quickly. The hen was already dead, so I had to run to the warehouse to boil hot water. My grandmother carried the dead chicken into the barn and said as she walked, we don't have enough branches at home. You and Xiuying go to the mountain to pick up branches. I nodded. Xiuying and I went to the mountain to pick up branches, and then we went home. But as soon as I entered the yard, my grandmother widened her eyes and asked, where is Yuanbao? Why didn't he come back with you? I was stunned for a few seconds and said, Yuanbao is at home. Only Xiuying and I went to the mountain to pick up branches. Grandma shook her head desperately. No, Yuanbao went with you. Xiuying said loudly, no, Yuanbao didn't follow us. Grandma retorted, I have been in a warehouse and didn't see Yuanbao at all. Yuanbao must have gone up the mountain with you. Go to the mountain to find him. I said affirmatively, impossible, although Yuanbao is small, he is very smart. If he followed us, he would definitely call us. Yuanbao must not have gone up the mountain. As soon as I finished speaking, my grandmother's face changed. She said with a gloomy face that if Yuanbao didn't go up the mountain, then where did he go? I think Yuanbao was lost by you. You didn't want Yuanbao to eat chicken, so you lost Yuanbao, right? Xiuying hurriedly explained, no, we didn't see Yuanbao. My grandmother asked with a gloomy face, where is Yuanbao? You two lost Yuanbao. What will you do when the adults come back? Why don't you go find Yuanbao quickly? My grandmother went into the barn after saying this. The hen she killed was still lying on the ground with blood, and the feathers on her body had not been plucked. Xiuying cried and said, Yuanfu, what should we do? Yuanbao is lost. I said firmly, Yuanbao was not lost by us. Yuanbao is smart. If he followed us, he would definitely call us. As soon as I finished speaking, I heard a faint cry from the west room. This cry was not only heard by me, but also by Xiuying. It was Yuanbao. Xiuying and I hurried into the west room and shouted Yuanbao in the west room. I heard a faint cry again. The sound seemed to come from the cabinet. This cabinet was very large and was my grandmother's dowry. I got close to the cabinet and put my ear to it. I heard a faint cry inside. Yuanbao was in the cabinet. Xiuying and I took great effort to open the cabinet a crack. The moment the cabinet was opened, I smelled a strong smell of blood. I moved the cabinet a little further and called Yuanbao's name into the cabinet. Yuanbao cried a little louder. Xiuying and I used all our strength to open the cabinet. The scene inside the cabinet scared Xiuying and me. We both collapsed on the earthen king and couldn't even shout. Our hands and feet were weak and our bodies were covered with sweat. Yuanbao was lying in the cabinet. His ears were gone and all 10 fingers were gone. I also saw Ziyue's clothes in the cabinet. Ziyue's clothes were covered with blood. Xiuying's hands were also shaking. She whispered, it's an evil ghost. I took a deep breath and pulled Yuanbao out of the cabinet. Yuanbao was covered in blood and was very weak. There were bite marks all over his body, which was shocking. Yuanbao, what's going on? As soon as I finished speaking, Yuanbao's eyes widened. I followed Yuanbao's line of sight and saw my grandmother standing at the door. I don't know when she appeared, and whether she heard what we said. My grandmother asked expressionlessly, what happened to Yuanbao? Why is he covered in blood? When my grandmother said this, I saw that her teeth had grown a lot longer. As soon as the grandmother finished speaking, Xiuying jumped out of the window. She ran and shouted, evil ghost who eats people. Someone come quickly, Tilda. My grandmother seemed not to hear Xiuying's words. She walked to me slowly and said with a smile, Yuanfu, be obedient, put Yuanbao in the cabinet. My grandmother smelled bad, like a pig that died of plague. It was very smelly. Yuanbao fainted, and I held Yuanbao tightly and didn't let go. Seeing that I didn't let go, my grandmother was anxious, and she widened her eyes and showed a ferocious expression. She grabbed Yuanbao's arm with one hand and snatched Yuanbao from my arms. The other hand pinched my neck and lifted me up. Just when I felt that I was going to die, I heard my grandfather's voice from the yard. "Mom, we are back." When my grandmother heard my grandfather's voice, she chuckled. Grandpa walked to the window and looked into the house. He was stunned. My grandmother's hair was completely white, her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked like a ghost. Seeing that my grandmother was about to strangle me to death, my grandfather rushed into the house. He hugged my grandmother tightly from behind, and then shouted to me, "Yuanfu, run, go find your grandmother, go find Taoist Chen." My grandmother's hand suddenly loosened, and I jumped out of the window when I had the chance. I ran and shouted, "Help, help. My grandmother has turned into an evil ghost." I ran to the entrance of the village and saw my grandma. My grandma asked, "Yuanfu, what happened?" I cried and said, "Grandma has turned into an evil ghost." My grandpa asked you to find Taoist Chen. My grandma's eyes widened instantly. She picked me up and ran towards the west end of the village. I don't know how long it took to run to Taoist Chen's house. Taoist Chen was sitting on a stool basking in the sun. My grandma said anxiously, "Taoist Chen, something bad has happened. My old lady has turned into an evil ghost." Taoist Chen frowned and asked, "How many people are there in your yard?" My grandma looked at me, and I said, "There are only my grandpa and my grandma in the yard." Hearing me say this, Taoist Chen's eyebrows relaxed. "Fortunately, there are only 2 people. If there are more people, it will be difficult to deal with. This ghost will possess. Let's go." Several of us hurriedly ran back to my house. My grandma was dumbfounded as soon as we entered the yard. There were several people standing in my yard. My second uncle, third uncle, my second uncle's son Dakwan, and daughter-in-law Hawa were all there. My grandma frowned and asked in a low voice, "Taoist Chen, what should we do?" Taoist Chen narrowed his eyes and said nothing. Grandma was tied up and pressed to the ground, and there was blood on the corners of her mouth. My third uncle said, "Taoist Chen, please think of a way quickly. What should we do? My mother has become an evil ghost." Taoist Chen said, "First lock the old lady in the warehouse, and you guys go to the back mountain to cut some peach branches." My grandfather asked Taoist Chen, "Do I still need to go?" My leg was bitten by my mother, and it hurts a lot. Grandpa's calf was bleeding and looked very embarrassed. Taoist Chen said, "Don't go yet, I have something to ask you." My grandfather nodded. My third uncle's eyes turned back and forth twice, and he and others went to the mountain to get peach branches. They left and there were only a few of us left in the backyard. Taoist Chen asked grandfather, "Did your mother only bite your leg after she became an evil ghost?" Grandpa frowned and replied, "She also bit my arm, but I dodged it." Taoist Chen asked again, "Why are there so many people in the house suddenly? Who called them?" Grandpa explained, "It was Xu Ying who called them. She called my brothers and others." Taoist Chen asked, "Which one is Xu Ying?" My grandfather replied, "Xu Ying didn't come. Xu Ying is the daughter of Dakwan's family. She is only 7 years old." Taoist Chen frowned and said nothing. At this time, Grandma asked Taoist Chen, "What's the matter?" Taoist Chen looked at my grandfather and said, "Get your mother out of the warehouse." Grandpa nodded and went into the warehouse. While my grandfather was in the warehouse, Taoist Chen took out 2 lucky bags from his pocket. He stuffed the lucky bag into my grandma's hand and whispered, "Take the lucky bag with you, so that the evil ghost can't possess you. Remember, no one in this courtyard can be trusted. It is very likely to be an evil ghost. I have to lead the evil ghost out." My grandma frowned and whispered, "How to lead it?" Taoist Chen whispered, "The evil ghost will eat people. He can't help it. Use people to lead it. I don't think your mother is an evil ghost, so I'll use her to lure her tonight." My grandfather got my great-grandmother out of the warehouse. My great-grandmother sat on the ground with a dull look, as if she had been greatly stimulated. Taoist Chen narrowed his eyes. Suddenly, a child's cry came from the west room. "Yuan Bao is still alive?" My grandmother hurriedly took Yuan Bao out of the west room. Yuan Bao shrank in my grandmother's arms, staring at Taoist Chen. My grandmother came to Taoist Chen and asked, "Taoist Chen, do you have any lucky bags?" Taoist Chen shook his head, "Lucky bags are rare, there are no extra ones." My grandmother frowned and said, "Poor Yuan Bao. As soon as my grandmother finished speaking, my third uncle and others came back with a lot of peach branches in their hands. Taoist Chen used peach branches to weave a large bamboo basket and put my great-grandmother in the bamboo basket. Taoist Chen said, "Hang the evil ghost on the locust tree for 3 days and 3 nights, and the evil ghost will die." As soon as Taoist Chen finished speaking, several people teamed up to hang my grandmother on a tree 5 or 6 meters high. My grandmother sat in a bamboo basket and cried loudly. She wanted to speak but couldn't make any sound. My third uncle asked, "Will Taoist Chen's method work?" "Don't worry, the evil ghost will die in 3 days." After Taoist Chen said this, he said to my grandmother, "Boil a few eggs and let everyone wrap them." My grandmother nodded and went to the warehouse to boil eggs. At night, my grandmother brought the eggs to the table. Everyone in the room was stunned when they saw the eggs, but no one spoke. Evil ghosts can't see eggs, only people can see them. My grandmother gave everyone an egg, and she smiled and said, "Everyone, eat it while it's hot." When my grandmother said this, her eyes were fixed on the people at the table. Everyone picked up the eggs and peeled them, but Yuanbao didn't take the eggs, and his fingers were gone. My grandma frowned. She put the peeled eggs into Yuanbao's bowl and said, "Yuanbao, eat it while it's hot." Yuanbao was stunned for a few seconds and asked, "What to eat?" As soon as Yuanbao finished speaking, everyone at the table looked at each other. My grandma said, "Eat what's in your bowl." Yuanbao looked at my grandma with a complicated look, and he smiled and said, "I don't want to eat eggs." When Yuanbao said this, he deliberately lowered his head to look at the bowl in front of him, but his bowl was obviously empty. Just now, my grandma had taken the eggs from his bowl. My grandma looked up at Taoist Chen, and Taoist Chen signaled my grandma not to make a sound. My grandma laughed dryly and said, "If you don't want to eat, don't eat." Yuanbao looked at the people at the dinner table coldly, and he said coldly, "Why are you all looking at me? You don't think I'm an evil ghost, do you?" Grandpa smiled and said, No, the evil ghost has been caught." Yuanbao snorted coldly, and his eyes moved slowly, revealing weirdness. "I'm going to sleep in the west room." After saying this, Yuanbao got off the earth and ran into the west room, and closed the door of the west room. Taoist Chen narrowed his eyes and said, "The evil ghost is in Yuanbao's body, and he is going to catch the ghost tonight." Everyone at the table stared with eyes wide open. My third uncle asked, "The evil ghost is in Yuanbao's body, so let my mother go quickly, the tree is windy." "We can't let her go yet, wait until midnight tonight. The evil ghost will definitely eat people and will definitely appear under the big tree. He will look up and jump up, then you will go around behind the evil ghost, tie the evil ghost with a rope, and I will kill the evil ghost with the talisman paper." Everyone at the table nodded in agreement. "Let's disperse, don't let the evil ghost get suspicious." Everyone at the table dispersed and went back to their own rooms. Taoist Chen said, "I will go back to get the talisman paper first, and I will definitely come back before midnight." Taoist Chen left after saying this. There were only 3 of us left in the room, and my grandfather sat on the king and sighed, "What a thing." My grandmother also sighed, "There is no way, we ran into it." As soon as my grandma finished speaking, my grandpa said, "Since the hungry ghosts are ingots, we should put my mother down. The wind on the tree is so strong that my mother will get sick from the cold." My grandma frowned and said, "Old man, listen to Taoist Chen. Let my mother endure it first and deceive the evil ghost first. I will send a quilt to my mother." After saying this, my grandpa picked up the quilt and was about to go out. My grandma hurriedly stopped my grandpa, "Don't go out." As soon as my grandma finished speaking, I saw my third uncle taking the quilt to the yard, and he threw the quilt to my great-grandma. My grandma said, "The third uncle has gone, so you don't have to go." My grandpa frowned and didn't go out. I lay on the windowsill and looked out. I seemed to see a black shadow following my third uncle, and the black shadow followed into the room where my third uncle lived. I rubbed my eyes, and my third uncle and the black shadow disappeared. At midnight, Taoist Chen had not returned yet. My grandma frowned and said, "Why hasn't Taoist Chen returned yet? Has he encountered any threat?" As soon as my grandma finished speaking, I heard the screams of my third uncle. He shouted, "Help, hungry ghosts are going to eat people." I leaned on the window and looked outside, and saw my third uncle running out of the house in a hurry, with blood on his face. Third uncle knocked hard on my door, "Open the door quickly." My grandma and grandpa looked at each other and exchanged glances. My grandma asked, "Third, what does the evil ghost look like?" My third uncle said, "It was Yuanbao. Yuanbao is an evil ghost, and it ate everyone in the house." My grandfather frowned and said, "I saw the evil ghost with my own eyes. It was clearly a shadow. Whoever you possess was an evil ghost. Third is lying." After saying this, my grandfather shouted outside the door, "Third, run." The door in the house couldn't be opened. My grandma whispered, "Is Third an evil ghost?" My grandfather nodded and said, "The third son wants to come into the house and eat us all." As soon as my grandfather finished speaking, my third uncle banged on the door outside the door. The banging sound was very loud, and my third uncle's voice became louder. He roared, "Open the door. If you don't open the door, I will eat you all." The wooden door of my house was banged, and my grandmother asked anxiously, "What should I do with the old man? He's about to come in." Grandpa frowned and said, "Climb up to the beam quickly and climb out from the roof. Hungry ghosts can't come up." Several of us stepped on the stool and climbed up to the beam with great effort. Grandpa poked a hole in the roof again, and several people climbed out through the hole. Grandpa was the last one to climb up, and the wooden door of my house was kicked open as soon as he climbed up. My third uncle entered the house viciously. He saw that there was no one in the house and saw the hole on the roof. He hurried to the yard and yelled at us, "Come down here, or I will climb up to the roof and eat you all." Grandpa frowned and said, "Climb up if you can, but I don't see how you can climb up without a ladder." As soon as Grandpa finished speaking, my grandma glared at him. "You are reminding him." Grandpa signaled my grandma not to speak. My third uncle smiled strangely, and he ran to the warehouse and took out a ladder from the warehouse. My third uncle put the ladder on the house, and he swallowed his saliva. Grandpa shouted, "Don't come over." My third uncle climbed towards the roof with his hands and feet. When he was about to climb to the top, my grandfather pushed the ladder away, and my third uncle fell to the ground. But my third uncle seemed to feel no pain, and put the ladder on the house and continued to climb up. When he was about to climb to the roof, my grandfather pushed the ladder away again. After repeating several times, my third uncle lay on the ground without moving. My grandmother asked, "Old man, did this evil ghost fall to death?" My grandfather frowned and said, "Let's wait until dawn." The next morning, several of us came down from the house and let my great-grandmother down from the tree. My third uncle was dead, and he fell to death. Yuanbao in the west room was also dead, leaving only a pool of blood. And my second uncle's family was left with only bloody clothes, which were all eaten by the evil ghost. Grandpa said anxiously, "We have to leave quickly." As soon as Grandpa finished speaking, I saw the gate of my house open and Taoist Chen entered the yard. My grandma asked, "Taoist Chen, why did you come just now?" Taoist Chen narrowed his eyes and said, "I was trapped by an evil ghost last night and couldn't get out." "What about the evil ghost?" "The evil ghost is dead." Taoist Chen laughed out loud, "It's better to be dead." At this time, my grandma suddenly said, "Taoist Chen, our family is moving away. I will return the things you gave me yesterday." Taoist Chen was stunned for a few seconds and asked, "What are the things I gave you?" "Lucky bag." Taoist Chen smiled and said, "A broken lucky bag, no need to return it." As soon as Taoist Chen finished speaking, my grandma changed her face. Taoist Chen smiled and stared at us. The look in his eyes became more and more weird. My grandma whispered, "We can't leave." Taoist Chen's laughter kept echoing in my ears. The end.